From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Dermatology Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinions featured in JAMA Dermatology.
Hello and welcome to this author interview from the JAMA Network. This is Dr. Adamson, the web editor for JAMA Dermatology. Narrowband ultraviolet B phototherapy, also referred to as narrowband UVB, is an effective treatment option for patients with psoriasis. However, many patients have limited access to this treatment because it's usually delivered in an office-based setting. In a new study in JAMA Dermatology, authors compared the effectiveness of home versus office-based narrowband UVB. This study was called the LITE Treatment Effectiveness, acronym LITE study. It is an investigator-initiated, pragmatic, randomized, open-label, parallel group, multi-center, non-inferiority trial. Dr. Joel Gelfand is a board-certified dermatologist and the James J. Layden, MD, endowed professor in clinical investigation in the Department of Dermatology at Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He is also the director of the Center for Clinical Sciences in Dermatology and director of the Psoriasis and Phototherapy Treatment Center. He's the first and corresponding author of this new article, and he's here to discuss this work and its potential implications on clinical practice. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Gelfand.
It's great to be here with you, Dr. Adamson.
I'm excited that I finally get you in the podcast. You do so much amazing work in the field of psoriasis and beyond. I'm glad that we're able to feature the LITE study, which I've heard about for many years.
Yes.
And so finally I get to see these results.
It's been a labor of love. And I think as we'll get into in this discussion, a new type of research in dermatology. So that's really patient-centered, work-driven by patient interest in this topic, very pragmatic, embedded in routine care. And I think the results are really compelling, as we'll discuss.
Yeah. And so for those that may not be familiar with you and your work, what is your focus at Penn? And are you mostly a researcher? Do you see patients also at the same time, only psoriasis patients, or do you see a broader group of patients as well?
Yeah, so I've been an academic dermatologist here at the University of Pennsylvania for my entire career. Did my residency here at Penn and been a faculty member here since inception. And my interest longstanding has been in common chronic inflammatory diseases. I'm also trained as an epidemiologist. I've had a primary interest in psoriasis all these years, but other work in hidradenitis and atopic dermatitis and CTCL, some other conditions from time to time. But a lot of my work is focused really on how psoriasis promotes cardiovascular disease, how severity of disease relates to cardiometabolic risk, what our therapies do to important cardiometabolic pathways in psoriasis, and of course, the comparative effectiveness of our treatments. And so the LITE study is really just an extension of the work that we've been doing for the last 2 decades, trying to get better outcomes for our patients in a way that is most patient-centered and meets our patients' needs.
And I also think this study is really great because it's an example of a study where you use like all of the tools in health services research to kind of come to bear. You know, it's patient-reported outcomes, epi, the pragmatic nature of this trial. And so I really wanted to have you on so we can talk about those various aspects related to the work.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about this, Ade, is that usually when we see a publication in JAMA Dermatology, a clinical trial, the entry criteria, there's like 30 of them, right? But in clinical practice, we don't go through a checklist of 30 things, right? And so the LITE study is very unique in that the criteria basically reflect clinical practice. I mean, essentially, to enter the study, you had to have psoriasis, and the clinician needed to think that you were an appropriate candidate for phototherapy at home or in the office, both medically and from a perspective of being able to be adherent. And the patient had to agree to be randomized. And that basically was essentially what the criteria are for entry. So it's very generalizable in terms of how we practice clinical dermatology.
And patients, they also could be on whatever topical treatment that they were when they decided to enter the study. Is that correct?
It's exactly right. In the real world, when a patient comes in and we're deciding on a course of action, we don't say, oh, you need to stop that biologic for 12 weeks before I'm going to put you on something, right? So it really reflects real world clinical practice. There were no washouts or exclusions for any other therapies. If they were currently on phototherapy, we asked them to be off of it for 2 weeks just because if they were randomized at home, we wouldn't know what dose to give them. If they're already getting a couple of joules, with each treatment in the office. And in the study, roughly 12% of people were currently on oral medications or biologics for psoriasis, which kind of suggests that despite all the advances we've made in dermatology, that there's still need for phototherapy, that there's plenty of people who in the real world are still struggling to get control of their disease. 40% of people, by the way, previously were on biologics or oral medications for phototherapy. So again, in the real world, people tend to cycle from therapy to therapy, or they may be doing okay but not great on their biologic. And so oftentimes people need other treatment options to get their disease under better control.
Or perhaps they may not like the side effects from their biologic. And phototherapy is probably one of the oldest treatments that we have for psoriasis. So it's great that you were able to do the study where you're trying to figure out is if we are able to give patients access to home therapy, are they more adherent? Do they do as well as patients that have to come to the office to get their phototherapy, which is a very practical question. And in particular, because, at least in my experience, a lot of patients may decline phototherapy at all because of the issue of coming into the office, 2, 3 times a week.
That's exactly right. I think for a lot of patients, despite us having a variety of ways of treating the disease, many patients may feel uncomfortable with pharmaceutical management of their disease. They don't want a pill or injectable medication. Particularly older patients sometimes are concerned about these things as well because they're already on a lot of medications for other health issues they're dealing with. And so phototherapy has to be a very patient-centered treatment option for disease. And when we initially got involved in this research, over a decade ago, we asked our colleagues in dermatology what their preferences were for psoriasis treatment, and phototherapy still ranked very highly. They often felt for typical patient with moderate severe psoriasis, ultraviolet B phototherapy was a great treatment option for them. When we asked dermatologists what we should compare in clinical trials, they wanted to compare biologics to each other. When we asked patients, they wanted to compare home phototherapy to office phototherapy. And so this study was funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI. And in this case, really, the patient interests is what we prioritize in this kind of research. So myself as a clinician and a researcher, this may not have been my number one priority on my list of things to do. But when we talked to patients and realized it was their number one priority, that really shifted our focus on what we were going to do in this work. And it's just a really great example of the importance of engaging patients in our clinical research, really from the very beginning in terms of prioritizing what work we're even going to do.
So let's get down to some of the nuts and bolts of the actual trial itself. So you explained a little bit about how patients were randomized to home versus office-based therapy. Could you tell us a little bit about what kind of unit did patients get? What were they being sent home on?
In this study, we used a Adewole 7 series with guided mode dosimetry. It's a standard device that's available for prescribing today. Adewole provided the machines for the purpose of the study, including the shipping to and from the patient's house. That was necessary in a research setting because, as people know, coverage of home phototherapy is so variable from plan to plan and often is quite delayed in getting approvals for it. So from a research perspective, we could not go through usual standard of care. We had to make it available to people. If they were on office phototherapy, it was a standard treatment in the office through insurance with copays and whatever else may be going on for the patient. So in the office, we encourage people to use the American Academy of Dermatology 2019 guidelines on how to use phototherapy for psoriasis, but they could do whatever protocol they use in their practice. We know in the real world, not everyone follows the exact guidelines that we publish. If they were randomized to home, the machine used the 2019 AAD guidelines of care protocol. And the machine is about the size of a doorway, just to give people listening just a sense of how large it is.
It's a flat panel?
It's a flat panel. Yeah, it's about 6 feet tall, approximately, plugs into a regular outlet. The patient stands in front of it with goggles on. They're provided by the manufacturer. They protect their genitals like they would in regular phototherapy. We encourage them to put a little moisturizing cream on the psoriasis beforehand just to improve penetration of the ultraviolet light. They get treatment in the front of their body. They turn around to get treatment in the back of their body, and they're done. Now, what's unique about the Adewole machine is that it has a built-in dosimeter. So the machine knows what dose it's delivering to the patient, and it has a controller that will ask the patient, okay, on your last treatment, did you have a sunburn? And how long did it last? exactly what we do in clinical practice, right? So now the machine then knows, okay, this is the patient's skin type, how darkly pigmented they are. This is when their last treatment is. And now the patient's told me what their response was to that treatment. And so it's going to dose them according to the standard AAD protocol that the machine was programmed with. Now, when prescribing home phototherapy, a clinician could modify the protocol however they want. They can make it less erythrogenic or more erythrogenic, depending on what their preferences are. Interestingly, in the trial, the hundreds of patients randomized to home treatment, none of the roughly 40 clinicians involved in the study ever altered the home protocol. And we had everyone from people just, regular dermatologists who were in prior practice, don't necessarily do that much phototherapy, to, world experts who are on the guidelines committee. So it goes to show you that the standard protocol is probably good enough in most circumstances.
Yeah, you were able to get buy-in from over 42 different practices. So, which is also a testament to not only your network, but also the amount of interest that there is in this clinical question.
I think our colleagues that participated in this study are some of the best among us because, when you're involved in this type of research, if people are randomized at home, well, that practice is going to lose clinical revenue. They're not doing phototherapy in the office anymore, right? And the funding from PCORI, I think, is quite reasonable, but it may not be as lucrative as, say, an industry study.
Mm.
So it just shows you how committed our colleagues in dermatology are to doing the type of research we need to help our patients get better outcomes in clinical practice. So I'm very inspired by the collaboration we have with our colleagues.
Okay, so let's get back to the trial. So you randomize folks to home versus office-based therapy. And your primary outcome to me also was something that's very interesting because often when we look at clinical trials for psoriasis, PASI scores are what we have as an outcome and not necessarily patient-reported outcomes. So you mind telling us what those outcomes were and why did you choose them? And also why the non-inferiority design?
Yeah. So let's unpack this. So first, the primary endpoints. So you're exactly right. Usually it's a PASI 90 these days, right? But the reality is in clinical practice, no one does a PASI. So we had done studies previously to show that the global assessment, the PGA, times the body surface area is essentially the same as a PASI. Okay, so we asked our clinicians to collect the PGA and the BSA so we could later on estimate what the PASI 90, PASI 75 would be for those of us who are obsessed with those type of statistics. But the PGA is interpretable and increasingly is a primary endpoint. So being clear, almost clear was one primary endpoint. Co-primary endpoint was having a DLQI score of mild to no impairment in health-related quality of life. These are performance measures that are endorsed by the American Academy of Dermatology and have been used in a variety of research studies over time. Non-inferiority design is a slightly different issue. And so it's a little conceptual, slightly difficult to explain, but basically what you're trying to say is, okay, treatment A is likely to get a certain response. Treatment B is within, say, 15% of that response. We would say they're similar enough, they're non-inferior. So how do we come up with a margin of 15%? So for example, if treatment A had a 30% response rate, treatment B had a 40% response rate, you would say these are working about the same, they're non-inferior. And we based that on the biosimilar studies from the FDA. Okay, so when the FDA does a study for biosimilarity, the average meta estimate out there, when you look at all the studies done, is around 15%. Sometimes a little larger, sometimes a little bit smaller, but usually about 15% is the margin. So that's a pretty good reassurance to our colleagues that that margin is a reasonable thing to test on. The other thing that was unique about the study, Ade, is that when you're doing patient-centered research, one of the questions you want to ask is, given my individual characteristics, how likely am I to do on this therapy? What we call heterogeneity of treatment effect. And in phototherapy, there's something unique based on someone's skin type. So you can imagine a scenario of someone's very fair skin that may say, well, at home, the machine's not so calibrated so tightly, maybe I'm going to burn too much. Or maybe if I'm, have a very darkly pigmented skin, maybe the fact that at home I only have 8 bulbs, compared to the office where you have maybe 40 bulbs, maybe the treatment time's going to take too long and it's going to be frustrating. I'm not going to like it. So we specifically designed the study to be representative of the 3 basic skin types: fair skin, medium complected skin, darkly complected skin, to prove non-inferiority within each of those groups. And that was another unique aspect of the study design that we did in the LITE study.
And so then, for the audience, what did you find? Was it non-inferior? And were you surprised of the result?
Yeah, so certainly our hypothesis would be that the two would work pretty similar to each other. They should be non-inferior to each other. Statistically speaking, we cannot claim that one treatment was better than the other. But clearly, if you look at the results, people on home therapy did a lot better in general than people did in the office. And this is true no matter what your skin type was, whether you had fair skin or darkly complected skin, they all did better at home compared to the office. Roughly about a third of patients became clear, almost clear at home or in the office. And more than half of patients had mild to no impairment in health-related quality of life at the end of treatment about 12 weeks later, compared to about a third of people on home treatment. So, from a clinician's point of view, we think they both did, fairly similarly. Maybe the delta is not that big. But from a patient point of view, the patients felt like they did a lot better when they were randomized to home treatment.
Joel, your LITE study findings are really interesting and, in my opinion, quite impressive. But office-based phototherapy is also something that's really important to dermatologists. And maybe there's some patients that may prefer it. Do you worry that maybe some people may not start offering office-based phototherapy? What is the role, do you think, of office-based phototherapy in the light of your study?
So I think it's a really important question today. And what the LITE study really showed is that patients do really well in the office as well, especially those who are adherent, who are able to get into treatment roughly 2 times a week. Their PASI 90 and being clear, almost clear, was roughly 50 to 60%. I mean, that's really good. And this is comparable to some biologics like TNF inhibitors, for example. And so, it's really critical that we as a specialty in dermatology continue to offer office phototherapy to our patients. Because one is it's important for psoriasis, but also a number of different conditions we treat: vitiligo, atopic eczema, cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, and other conditions people have. And the other thing is in the LITE study, we understood about patients' ability to participate. And for many people, they couldn't participate in the study because they didn't have space in their home, especially people in the inner city, often patients of color. And they said, I'd love to do treatment at home, but I have no space for a machine like this. Or maybe patients have said, I'm a little nervous about the technology. I'd rather have a nurse administer it. That's totally fine. And what we as clinicians need to be able to do is have shared decision making with patients, meet them where they are. And I think making office phototherapy more available to patients is really important for our specialty. And that's probably a multifactorial process we need. One is we need insurers to lower the barrier for patients. They need to eliminate copays for office phototherapy. And two is they need to improve reimbursement for office phototherapy as well. I mean, the costs of delivering phototherapy are substantial to clinical practices. And there's also space involvement and a need to maintain these machines. And so if insurers make office treatment more available to patients, more patients will pursue it, and fewer will probably end up needing systemic agents for their disease. And the ultimate cost of the system is going to be lower for payers as well.
That's something to me that's is interesting from a policy payer perspective. Are there potential cost savings here? Or maybe that's a tough question because it depends on how you ask that. Is it savings for the patient that may have to have a lot of copays if they go the office-based route versus the cost of the machine if they go the home route and how much that costs for the insurance? How does cost fit in here?
Yeah, so one of the things we try to do here is understand indirect cost to patients. I think from patient-centered research, that's the most important part of the cost, if you will. And so those randomized to office, they spent roughly $20 per treatment just commuting back and forth to the office for treatment, whether it be taking public transportation or parking, gas, or whatever it may be. They also spent roughly $20 a treatment in copays. And we probably underestimated the copay for patients because basically when the doctor prescribed phototherapy, the first thing we did was figure out, okay, what would the cost be to you? And if their copay was too high, the patient said, I can't do this. And they didn't proceed forward. They didn't get randomized. So the cost to patients is probably higher than we estimated in the study. Now, compared to a biologic for a patient, for many patients, if you prescribe a biologic, say risankizumab, which may cost tens of thousands of dollars a year, the patient may have no out-of-pocket costs for risankizumab because if there's copays, the company may pick it up. Right.
Hmm.
So we have issues in the system where patients often get incentivized to more expensive therapies because the costs to them are much higher. Yet the cost of the system is much higher for some of the more expensive therapies. For home treatment, of course, they really had no indirect costs. They were getting the machine as part of the study. The machine we used in the study costs roughly $6,000 to Medicare. It's generally covered by Medicare. So the cost of the patients can be based on what plan they have, what cost sharing they may have as well. And the next phase of the work is do something called implementation science, where we want to work with different payers and figure out, okay, well, what's the best way to implement these findings? Because, if you end up making something expensive to the patient or make it that's hard to prescribe for the doctor, then that's going to channel people towards other therapies that they may not want or that may be way more expensive for the health system.
Yeah, actually, that was getting my next question. What's next? It sounds like, this is becoming even more of a health services research problem. You're going all the way from patient-centered design now to implementation science.
That ends up being so important in this work today. When we generate good data for clinical practice, it takes a long time for it to be implemented in clinical practice. The work we did in psoriasis and cardiovascular risk that we published in 2006 or so in JAMA really changed the perception of psoriasis in terms of the risk of cardiovascular events and mortality. Yet screening for cardiovascular risk factors is still probably less than 5% of patients are getting screened for their lipids or their blood pressure in clinical practice when they see a dermatologist for psoriasis. We have implementation science studies geared to solve that problem as well, looking at the effect of care coordination. And same here, I think that for our colleagues, the data is very compelling. I mean, it's akin to a phase 3 clinical trial in a way, the size and scope of the study. I think the data clearly supports that home phototherapy should be a first-line treatment option for psoriasis. And even in patients who never did phototherapy before, it worked just as well. And so there's really no reason to say, well, let's try office treatment first and see how you do. That's often just not practical for many patients. But home phototherapy, if you prescribe it in clinical practice, well, you have to deal with insurance approvals, which would be difficult and delayed. And then you need to make sure the patient gets the machine and knows how to use it. And so I think working with payers and other stakeholders to figure out how can we make this as easy as possible for our colleagues. And some networks, like say Kaiser, for example, they recognized many years ago that their patients really preferred home phototherapy. And so they have a whole implementation strategy available for people with psoriasis. And what they've learned is that it works quite well. When people use home phototherapy at Kaiser, they're less likely to use expensive therapies over time for psoriasis. But a lot of it gets managed by an administrative team, or actually their pharmacists. So the dermatologist knows they can prescribe it, it's going to get covered, and then someone's going to help answer the questions for the patient and make sure they're using the machine properly. In a way, that's kind of what happens at Penn. When I prescribe a biologic, we have a specialty pharmacist who gets involved with the patient, make sure they understand the drug, make sure they're using it right, that they're adherent with it, make sure they get their refills appropriately when they're due, that they get their follow-up appropriately. And I think we need to build these sort of systems in place to make sure that home phototherapy is easy to use for a clinician.
Joel, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you being on the podcast.
It's great being with you.
I am Dr. Adamson, and I've been speaking with Dr. Joel Gelfand about the LITE study and its implications for home versus office-based narrowband UVB treatment for psoriasis. You can find a link to this paper in this episode's description. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by Daniel Musisi at the JAMA Network. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next episode of the JAMA Dermatology Podcast.